by the Minister of Canadian Heritage last month in her major vision speech on the future of Canadian culture and news online. We look forward to formally launching this exciting project later this fall. And just last Thursday at the Economic Club of Canada, as part of our Canadian Election Integrity Initiative, we announced a 2-year partnership with Canada's news literacy organization, Media Smarts, to develop thinking, resources, and public service announcements on how to spot misinformation and false news online. Tonight, I'm proud to share that we are, in partnership with the Canadian Journalism Foundation, taking another important step forward. It's my honor to announce the new CJF Facebook Journalism Project News Literacy Award, the first award of its kind from Facebook. This award, which carries a $10,000 purse and that will last for an initial 3-year period, will celebrate journalistic efforts that encourage Canadians to understand and assess the quality of news in their communities. It will also recognize best practices that underpin factual reporting as key contributions to Canadian democracy. Open to Canadian media organizations, Canadian journalism schools, and Canadian journalists working here and abroad, the award can be applied to a range of projects, including journalistic works that explore the relationship between journalism and democratic engagement, with a focus on models for the future of news, projects that test new and innovative ways to enlighten audiences about the time, effort, and costs involved in maintaining standards of excellence and factual reporting in professional journalism in the digital age, and innovative initiatives that help create an informed news audience by providing them with the tools to help expose misinformation. Our aim is both to reward and bolster journalistic efforts that help Canadians become the thoughtful, critical, and informed news consumers that a strong democracy depends upon. On behalf of Facebook and the Facebook Journalism Project, I want to thank the Canadian Journalism Foundation, in particular Natalie Turvey and Chris Waddell, for their creativity and thought leadership in helping develop this award. We are truly honored to build this partnership with you and excited for all that there is to come. And now I am pleased to welcome, I think, a man who probably needs no introduction in this audience, the chair of the Canadian Journalism Foundation and, of course, editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, David Wamsley.
Thanks, Kevin. On behalf of the CJF, I'd also like to thank Facebook Journalism Project for partnering on this event and for partnering on the CJF Facebook Journalism Project News Literacy Award, the first of its kind, as you've just heard this evening. Given today's political climate and the spread of lies, also more politely known as fake news, it's critical that Canadians understand the role that journalism plays in our democracy, how quality journalism is produced, and how to determine which sources of information are reliable and can be trusted. We're delighted to add the CJF Facebook Journalism Project News Literacy Award to our programming in order to reward and highlight media initiatives that are working to create informed news audiences. And a welcome to our Facebook Live audience. This is the first time our J-Talks have been brought to you live on Facebook. People can also join the conversation at the hashtag CJF Talk on Twitter. Hashtag CJF Talk on Twitter. Our J-Talks explore ongoing challenges that shape journalism. And it wouldn't be possible if we weren't able to have the support of people such as, and groups such as BMO Financial Group, our J-Talk series sponsor, and in-kind supporter, CISION. Now on to tonight's discussion. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Anne Kornblut, Pulitzer Prize winner for her work as the lead editor of the Washington Post's coverage of the Edward Snowden revelations. She served as White House correspondent, covering the 2000, 2004, and 2008 presidential campaigns, and wrote a book about women in politics after covering Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin in the 2008 campaign. She's now Director of Strategic Communications at Facebook. Please join me in welcoming Anne.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me see if I can make that work and not give you any feedback. Am I good? Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much for having me here tonight. There is no subject dearer to my heart than news and the role that information plays in society, especially in democracies around the world. Before I came to Facebook, as you heard, I spent 2 decades plus in the news business, and I'm always going to consider newsrooms to be my real home. They're my favorite places on earth, full of I think, the best kinds of people who are out seeking the truth, which is the subject we're here to discuss tonight. I was especially delighted to come to Canada. My sister went to McGill. It's always wonderful to come, especially now that I'm in California, to get some seasons. And even in this time at Facebook, we're having, as you may have read, or some of you may have covered up here, we've been in the news lately. We have U.S. congressional hearings coming up next week, and so it's a very busy time at Facebook on a number of fronts, all of them tied to the topics that we're going to discuss tonight, which is the intersection of news and information and technology and media and power and democracy. So I'm really grateful that you're all here. At the risk of dating myself, I want to, I like to think back to when technology first became a really big part of my life as a journalist. I covered the 2000 presidential campaign. I was at the Boston Globe at the time, and we covered the New Hampshire primary, and the internet was suddenly the way that everyone was started to file stories. And so we wandered around with these giant laptops and cords that you had to plug into a phone jack to upload a story, but this was very advanced. You didn't have to, go into a newsroom anymore. You had this great liberating technology, and we spent most of the 2000 campaign knocking on doors of unsuspecting voters, asking if we could borrow their phone jack and uploading our stories and waiting for that buzzing sound. You remember the sound of the internet when it first came along? And people at that time were thrilled with the new technology and disappointed by it, even then when it was so rudimentary and it wasn't really changing the economics or anything yet. For journalists, I think a lot of people were dismayed that they'd gone from being required to file their stories once a day to now having to do it twice a day. That was the big revolution. You had to file it in the morning and in the evening, which I think for most people here would be a relief if you only had to file twice a day. But the acceleration since then, and I think the acceleration of a lot of the trends that we saw starting that year, has increased and gotten faster, and the changes keep coming, I think, faster than anyone can anticipate. The topic of tonight's panel, I think I can do a little poll here. The topic of tonight's panel is, did technology kill the truth? Does anyone think technology killed the truth? Raise your hand. I want to see who thinks it. Okay. And who thinks technology set it free? And who thinks it's somewhere in the middle? Our view at Facebook is that technology is not inherently good, nor is it inherently bad, but it's the responsibility of the people who work in technology to maximize the good and minimize the bad. And I think that's why I raised my hand for it being somewhere in the middle. I think it's not a human entity. We have to work together to make sure that the good is done. And that's one of the reasons I've been so happy to come to Facebook and to be a part of that discussion. As I said at the outset, and then I'll stop talking, my first love has been the news business and the news industry, and I have felt it's very important at Facebook to be a part of the conversation about how our company intersects with the news world and how we do our part to be responsible players, to help journalists do their work, to help the news media's financial models survive through this tumultuous time, and how, importantly, we can make sure that people who want true information get true information. And so that is my job currently at Facebook. It's one of my jobs currently at Facebook, but it's also why they let me escape occasionally to come out and talk about the work we're doing. And with that, I want to reintroduce you to the people on the panel who I believe are in the programs, and I hopefully won't butcher anyone's names here. Jane Litvinenko, did I get that right?
You got it.
From BuzzFeed. Patrick Lagacé from La Presse. Denise Balkassoon from the Globe and Mail. Jonathan Kay, who's an author and columnist for the National Post. And Nahid Mustafa, who's an award-winning writer and broadcaster. Please welcome our panelists here. Thank you. I want to start with a very basic question. How has the digital era, for you, changed what it means to be a journalist? Jane?
That's a big question. In my work, a lot of what I do is I report on misinformation and on fake news. And what technology has allowed me to do is go into communities and sort of track where it all begins. Not necessarily just, say this is false, or no, that guy did not burn down while taking a nap at the morgue. But actually figure out, okay, why is misinformation spreading, who's spreading it, and what is the motivation? Before that, I think that I don't know, I'm very young, but I might have had to dig or do so much more legwork than I do right now. And I think it's really changed the way that I report and I approach the topic.
How about you?
I started in the news business in 1997, and there was one computer right behind the night editor, and it was black and white, and it was an old Mac, and the internet was something like a rumor. And then one day we all had new computers, and we all had the internet on our desk, and it changed everything. And I frankly don't know how my forebears managed to do journalism before that. I know that, of course, we did find people, and we did break important stories. I'm not saying now we're better. I think we're just evolving. But the main thing to me, how technology changed my work, is I believe journalism is about speaking with people. You go out and you get the story. You go out and you get the experiences. And when I started as a columnist in 2003, I remember thinking, geez, wouldn't it be great if I could, put a tap on people's experience to write about, a given topic. I don't know, anything. Think of anything. What you had to do was basically build a mailing list and email your friends and say, has everybody ever had a bad teacher or stuff like that? Today, I go on my Facebook page. I do, I don't know what's the word in English. We call it an appel à tous in French, call for experience. And all-point bulletin, okay? And within a few hours, I have 300 people responding about cancer, about access to mental health resources, about money, about love, stuff like that. And it gives me a great sample of human experience. And I can dig in that and try and find stories. The bad side, how technology changed my work and I would say I am now, my competitors are not people from other news organizations. My competitors are people in their basement creating new realities, alternative realities that do not exist. But geez, wouldn't it be great if the government really did control your mind with chemtrails? Geez, in Quebec and elsewhere, wouldn't it be great if there was really a Muslim invasion of the West? I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying it happens. I'm saying people are believing it, and I am competing with these people when I'm trying to inform my readership.
Mm-hmm. How about we just go on down the line? How about you, Denise? How did it change your...
I think one of the best parts for me has been sort of things that I believed audiences. I believed that there were audiences for stories that I was interested in, but now we have proof often of that. And I think that's been really great for me because to know that topics that are maybe not considered mainstream or subjects that are not easily accessible want to speak to journalists and that the public wants to know those stories has definitely been one of the best experiences for me as a journalist. I think the negative would be, aside from false information, just the speed and sometimes feeling that there's absolutely no way that I can even know the entirety of everything that I want to know, let alone process it and share it with an audience.
Absolutely. How about you, Jonathan?
I guess I agree with a lot of what Denise said, that you discover that there's audiences for stories. But there's also a flip side. I think I may be the oldest member on this panel. And I remember actually when David Walmsley and I were working at the National Post, every single reporter could walk around the newsroom thinking that their story was the most popular in that day's paper because there were no metrics. And it was... And it was wonderful, because you had no feedback, and there was this daily ritual, which will sound Victorian, where reporters would go to the letters editor and say, "So any letters?" And And the editors would say, sorry, Sam. Okay. And, 8 for you, 5 for you. And that was the only systematic feedback you'd get. Short of people actually mailing you letters or throwing, boycotting the paper, which actually happened once or twice, that was your daily feedback. And suddenly, people in the room know what Chartbeat is. It's this technology hangs on TV screens in every newsroom. You have this thing. It's like an EKG for your career, where you can actually see like the top 50 articles and how they're performing. And I agree with Denise that it's awesome that, oh my God, it turns out people really want to read about this thing. But then there's all these other people who thought they were writing articles that people wanted to read, and turns out they weren't. And some of this, it turns out the numbers on book reviews at most newspapers are terrible. A lot of newspapers still publish book reviews for reasons not associated with hit count. But the delusion that writers had that everything they wrote was being read, was being smashed, and careers were changed because some people who we thought of as very popular writers, it turned out people were not reading them, and vice versa. And so it became, in many ways, like other industries where you have metrics, you have feedback, sort of like at a fast food restaurant, they measure how many burgers you can flip. Part of the industry came like that, and it has good and bad effects, but it meant we were more accountable, and we had to live in reality and not just imagine that everything we wrote was being appreciated by an audience.
So a lot of the same things, but I would say that one of the things that has happened, which is sort of a building on what John just said, the idea that what readers like can play such a huge role in how we produce what we produce and what we produce, which, I've been in this long enough, long before the internet ever came around, and you sort of sat around and picked stories which maybe weren't, which also maybe wasn't a fair way to do it, but the fact that so much of what you end up doing is dictated by what resonates, and how do we measure what resonates. So I would say that that's probably something that's always in the mix on a daily basis in this business, which is something profoundly different than when I first started out.
That's a great point. It gets to something that we think about and are required to answer a lot at Facebook, which is about people's preferences. And this goes to the question of the algorithm, which on Facebook is what decides what's in your news feed and is largely based on personal preference. As newsrooms start to think more and more about what people want, which, as you say, and as I remember, for a long time wasn't really part of the equation. I mean, I remember back when comments on stories online was very controversial. Why should you let readers comment? They don't know anything. That was the attitude. But it does raise a question, is the opinion of the readership is what the readers want to some extent overrated? Is there something that is there an objective set of truths that whether they are fun or desirable or something people want to read or not, is the obligation of journalism to go find and to produce, whether or not it's popular? And how do you measure that sort of eating your vegetables component of news against what the catnip, the cat videos, whatever the fun stuff on the other end of the spectrum is? How do you strike that balance, especially as a commercial enterprise that most newsrooms need to be? Go for it. Okay, great.
What I used to tell people when I was an editor, which I'm not anymore, was that things are U-shaped. So that on one end of the spectrum are things that are brand builders and that are incredibly authoritative articles, and you're just never going to get your money back on that article. Like when the Toronto Star spends $100,000 on a huge investigative piece, they might get a ton of hits on it, but on a cost-benefit basis, they're never going to recoup that money. They're doing it because it's a brand builder. People pick it up and say, well, that's why I trust the Toronto Star, because they're doing that kind of investigative journalism. It's a capital-intensive, high-payoff thing that will pay off over years by building a brand. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you get quick-hit 800-word pieces that people may write in an hour and a half about, flavor of the moment articles that very little investment, but it might get 100,000 page views. And on a purely cost-benefit basis, the newspaper comes out ahead because it might have been a quarter of a reporter's day, and you're number one on Chartbeat. It's the stories in the middle that get killed. So it's this thing that it's not the $100,000 investigation of Sick Kids Hospital or Gian Gomeshi or Rob Ford. And it's also not going to set the internet on fire because it's a hot take. But it's the story that's kind of your daily grind beat journalism story that's interesting and informative and edifying, but not enough people want to read it to make it a hit, and it's not a brand builder. And that's why beat journalism is in trouble, because those are the stories that beat journalists produce, which is why the trend is more toward general assignment, who either gravitate toward the 3-month project or toward the hour-and-a-half quick hit piece.
We used to talk about those as stories that have yesterday in the lead. That there's no appetite anymore for just kind of the regular yesterday at the courthouse, yesterday on Capitol Hill, yesterday. Yes?
I mean, maybe there's no appetite for that in the printed paper, but I guess that's where social media comes in, maybe specifically Twitter, because I think people do expect their beat reporters to be at city council or wherever and just saying what goes along. And so maybe they don't file a story today about whatever mess the TTC is in, but hopefully 2 or 3 times a year they file a really great story about what's happening with the TTC, and it's sort of
That's absolutely true.
educated by that day-to-day grind.
Sometimes they'll send a columnist to City Hall instead of a reporter, because they might know the columnist will get tons of hits, whereas the reporter might be more. So that it's like, I agree with you, but it's slightly changed. They're still thinking of the hit count, even if it's a daily grind story sometimes.
I want to add a third possibility to the list, and I think that's maybe traditional media organizations haven't necessarily gotten used to the idea of coming to their audience. So I think one thing that the internet has allowed us to do is allowed us to see a lot of these communities that have been built that might not have otherwise gotten built. Whether they're marginalized voices or whether they're the alt-right or whether there's somebody who's just crazy about City Hall politics, those communities all exist out there. And I think that with the previous printed model, you sort of expected your readers to pick up the paper, right? And they're coming to you, they're paying, I don't know, how much was it, half a cent for a paper back in the old days? I'm kidding, of course. But with the internet, newspapers and media organizations now have a chance to come to their audience. So, for example, if you're writing something very specific about City Hall, why not find a bunch of Facebook groups and just drop your story in there and get feedback? And we've seen success on that type of project from media organizations, both in the U.S. and abroad. And that's also how a lot of misinformation spreads. So fake news doesn't spread because somebody puts it on a Facebook page necessarily. Fake news spreads because they find a friendly audience that will continue sharing it with their social network. So I think that there might be another way or another approach to journalism, to beat reporting, to those investigations versus fun articles that we haven't necessarily tried out as much as we could be trying out.
That's a great point. I think one of the challenges, though, is that at the end of the day, I think we haven't really even had that deep conversation about what is journalism now, right? So back in 2006, the key job that I do, I work as a producer at the CBC. And one of the things that was happening was we were sort of seeing this shift in technology, who was using what and how we were, how reporters were doing their jobs. And I remember at one point, this reporter, very sort of a veteran of the city beat, he'd come in and he dumped all of his gear on my desk and said, "There you go." And I just looked at it. I was like, what is this? I don't, what is it that you want me to do? And, the point was he wasn't going to do anything. He collected what he needed to collect, and now it was my job to sort of shepherd that piece to the point where we could now use this item. And after I was annoyed, and when I was done being annoyed, it sort of occurred to me that this is going to be the new shift, right? This is going to be the people that can kind of keep up with how things are changing and the people who can't or won't. But I think that at that time, we still weren't talking about how is what we need to be doing on a day-to-day basis going to inform the job that we're supposed to do? But not only, how is that then going to reflect back on what we think our job is, right? So in a lot of ways, for example, with the technology, and this comes up all the time, and you alluded to it in your opening remarks, that the technology is neither good nor bad. It's how we take it up for good or evil. And I sort of, I contest that. I mean, I don't think that the technology is sort of content agnostic, right? I think technology really does push people to behave in certain ways. So that's like saying, this room is set up so that we're up here and you all are looking at us, and this is going to create a particular relationship. If we're seated in a circle, that creates a different relationship. The technology is the same. And so we kind of rushed off to use this technology and sort of thought all of these different ways it's going to be neat and exciting, and we can, file twice a day instead of once a day. But if you're filing twice a day, are you filing half a story each time, or is it a more shallow story twice a day? If it is a more shallow story twice a day, well, how are you filling in that shallower story? And all of these things reflect back on all of that until we find ourselves in 2017, as Patrick said, that my competition isn't other newspapers. My competition is a guy in his basement making stuff up. And I think that if you stand back, I think we will see not a straight line, but a line enough that we can see how we got here. And I think a lot of it is a lack of reflection.
Which is why everyone, newsrooms, tech companies, each one of us has choices to make in designing the technology and designing the room and figuring out how we use it. It's been interesting to see the evolution, I think, in some newsrooms, even ones that started out having a lot of quick hits, deciding to either dial it back or become more news heavy because they realized actually people wanted that. I know when I was at the Washington Post, we, using Chartbeat, discovered over a period of time that people, yes, they liked a certain amount of what we would all consider superficial stories, but actually some of the deeper investigative, and especially stories that were written like a story, stories that were written as a narrative, had even more engagement. And we started trying to measure differently, measure by the length of time that someone spent with a story versus just the number of clicks that a story got, especially if things were clicked through and no one read it. Yes?
I was going to say, how do you call it? Chartbeat?
Chartbeat, yes.
Okay, we don't have that at La Presse, and I see that my editor-in-chief is over there, and I wonder why, comment ça se fait qu'on n'a pas ça, nous autres? So apparently you guys have the stories on a board, and you know who's getting read and not? Mm-hmm. This is crazy.
In real time.
Okay, we had a situation at La Presse a couple months ago where somebody emailed to the whole newsroom the reader rates, the statistics for a specific edition. And people were livid. I mean, there was a reckoning for some people. They found out that they were either read or not read, and not as read it. I mean, this is crazy. I wish that we will never have that. And a funny thing happened because I have of course, my union, we have a union at La Presse, one of their talking points these days is that, it's the dictatorship of clicks. They're afraid that the clicks will drive stories and stuff like that. What I found out when I was reading this thing, the statistics for a certain Saturday, was the fact that, I think that our editors are doing a good job of protecting the beats that are not that wide read. And I think that's one of the editors... in a modern era, in a newspaper, we're not even a newspaper starting in January. You will only be digital. One of their struggles will be protecting the newsroom from the dictatorship of the clicks. Because what I found out when I read these things is that important beats, important columnists who were not that read, were getting play and were getting sent everywhere to pursue stories. But of course, if you get different ownership who has a different view, this could all crumble down. But again, you Anglos are crazy to put up these statistics.
Sure.
So I have a question question for you about that. What is it that you think has kept either your paper specifically, or maybe it's journalism culture in Quebec specifically? What has kept you out of that sort of tyranny of the click?
Maybe one thing has to do with culture. The other thing is that we're not that web-driven. For those who don't know, I work for La Presse. La Presse is going tablet-based. So we have an app that we developed. Works great for the market. In Quebec, it generates dozens of millions of dollars. The issue, of course, is it enough dozens of millions of dollars to sustain the journalism we do? But it's not we're not that web-based. So that's the thing. On a more personal basis, so that's what I think. And just one thing, I used to have a blog. I knew I was fairly well-read. I never wanted to know how much clicks I did get from, individual stories. And same thing with the columns I do right now. I wouldn't want to know because I don't want it to drive the choices I make. Sometimes I do stuff that I know will generate a lot of reading, because it's a bit complicated. Even though we're on the tablet, our stories can be shared on Facebook and stuff like that. So there's also the individual responsibility of journalists, if they can, in the environment where they work, do the important stories also. But to me, journalism has always been trying to make the important interesting.
That's such a great way to put it. And it leads me to one of the questions I have for this group, which is if you're thinking about what the audience or the readership might be interested in, but there's also holding power to account. And I think that's obviously the important role that journalism plays in any democracy. How does the internet, the web, the era of social media, how has that helped or not helped in holding the powerful accountable? And do you think there are things, and I ask this as an interested party at Facebook, that anyone in technology could do to make holding the powerful accountable easier for journalists?
Go for it. Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. It's a great question. I think it goes back to what we were talking about before about beat reporting. There are some stories that only emerge from great beat reporting because you have to develop trust with sources. I'll give you one example. Ben Spur of the Toronto Star. He's the transit reporter. I read him because I like trains, and it's interesting. And also because Ben Spur was there when he got this amazing scoop about how a well-connected politician maybe was putting his thumb on the scale to create a train station that would cost tens of millions of dollars that maybe wasn't justified by the arm's length analysis commissioned by Metrolinx. That's interesting. He only got that story because he knew the beat. If he were a general assignment story, who was saying, hey, go write a story about Metrolinx today, he never would have gotten that story. Health reporters. If you don't know people who are in the health industry, you're just not going to get good stories. So that U-shaped thing that I was talking about, where you're either spending 3 months chasing down the next Rob Ford or Gian Gomeshi, or you're spending 90 minutes doing the next quick hit on Harvey Weinstein. In the middle, and I think Denise is right about this, is you have to go to City Hall every day for a couple of years before someone hands you the brown envelope. You can't just show up and get the brown envelope. The second thing is there will always be people breaking bombshell stories at the federal level in every country. The problem comes at the state and provincial level. So look at the Miami Herald. Miami Herald used to be like one of the great investigative papers of the United States. And it didn't necessarily break stories at the national level. It was breaking stories about things that were going on in Florida, which were like crazy stories. New York State, I mean, I don't know if you read the New York State section of the New York Times. Like, what's going on in Albany is insane. What's going on in North Carolina is insane. Like, some of the greatest political stories are going on in state legislatures. And the only reason these exist is because you have a legacy core of beat reporters who have sources there and are covering it. In 10 years, that core of beat reporters won't exist, and you're not going to hold leaders to accountable at the state and municipal level. You might still do it at the federal level because it's glamorous, and you've got NPR and Washington Post and New York Times. You're not going to do it at the state level, and you're not going to do it at the provincial level.
Yeah. Everyone's going to want to jump in. We'll go here. Start here, and then we'll go on down. Yeah.
What? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. My answer has to do with money. How do we hold power accountable in the digital era? But it will encapsulate what John just said. My biggest fear is about money. The business model of the so-called old media, legacy media, like La Presse, like the Globe and Mail, like the Star, stuff like that, is being shattered. I was sued a couple of years ago, and it took years before we even had a court date. It was complicated, but it cost $200,000 to defend me, and it never proceeded to court. Good journalism takes money. John mentioned an investigation at the Toronto Star that cost $100,000. I'm sure that at La Presse we had investigation that cost proportionately as much money. So my fear is that we're going to get to a point where we're not going to have enough money to do these important yet not that interesting stuff, and we won't have the money to defend people like me and my colleagues. And money has to do with putting people on beats, because from a money point of view, I guess it's much more lucrative to have generalists, people on who work for the general assignment desk, and one day you do transit, one day you do health and stuff like that. It costs money to put people in those beats. My fear is that, and it's not good or bad, it's nobody's fault. My fear is that money will put us in a situation where we can't do the important thing and defend it in court, because attacked we are in court. I mean, we're threatened with lawsuit every day.
Well, I was just going to say that I think part of this has to do with how we think about reporting, right? I mean, Jane has a ton of experience beat reporting the alt-right, which is almost, I would imagine, I'll obviously speak for herself, but I imagine it's an entirely digital beat. Terrorism, in a lot of ways, is the same thing, right? You're cultivating sources online. The people that you're cultivating are online. The people you're cultivating are not necessarily just hanging out at City Hall. But then again, it does come back to that piece, because who's willing to do that hard work for such little money, right? And the people that are they getting the support that they need? And it's not just necessarily support around defending them in court. One of the concerns that I have when I see a lot of the younger, my younger colleagues that are out there sort of on the front lines of social media, which might sound like a weird thing to say, but which can be a very fraught and kind of violent place. What kind of supports do they have in terms of their mental health care, their emotional care? So that's another cost that we're not necessarily thinking about. But maybe I'll hand it over to one of my younger colleagues who can talk to that.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pivot to video. No, I'm kidding. I want to sort of be a little bit more positive about it, because something that the internet has brought with it is an entirely new toolbox, new tools, new ways of reporting that just weren't there 20 years ago. So, and I don't just mean, hanging out in Facebook groups, figuring out what's going on there, or on 4chan or Reddit or what have you. What I mean is that everybody uses the internet, whether it's, a Macedonian teen creating fake news, probably not in his basement. I think that we should get out of the basement metaphor. Or if it's an important MP on the Hill. Right? Those digital traces are always there. And we as journalists can use this completely new set of tools to figure out, okay, are there things that they are hiding that I can find with this set of digital strategies that I use to investigate? And I think the other thing is going back to online communities. Often as reporters, when we're on one beat, sometimes we get a little bit of tunnel vision. Right, but because online allows us to go into a bunch of these communities, and what are the horrible ones that maybe we need to talk to our therapist about, or the positive ones, they give us a new perspective on power. And I don't know if that power is even necessarily always in the hands of government. Maybe it's in the hands of a big corporation. Maybe it's in the hands of somebody who's making millions of dollars off of spreading misinformation. And when we do think about the internet, I think that there is a lot of good that can be done there, because that tool set is open for anybody to adapt and explore.
Do you want to jump in here too?
I was going to say that one of the things that I find a little bit troublesome is that the internet does allow people in power to it enables power to bypass media entirely, which has happened in Canada with, the Harper government. I remember made certain announcements just entirely on Twitter and Facebook. Obviously, Donald Trump doesn't have to take questions, and he just gets to say what he wants. And I don't know how to get around that. As a journalist, I wonder what the platforms, what the responsibility is, or what it might look like to recognize that and help disrupt it. But I don't know the answer to that one. It's just sort of what I think of every time I see some sort of political announcement happening in a place where media doesn't have access.
That's a great question. I want to try and open it up to the room in just a minute here. So if we could, we're going to have microphones that are going to go out to whoever wants to ask a question. And I would ask that you say your name, your affiliation, ask a question, not a statement, if you could. And if the microphones are ready to go now, we could do it, or I can ask another one here. Does anyone have a question at the moment, or should I keep going? Question? Oh, look at that. Didn't take any time at all. Okay.
Since we're talking a lot about...
Can you start by give us your name and your affiliation, and stand up so we can see you. Thank you.
Oh, my God. Hi, my name is Marissa. I'm from Ryerson. And I wanted to ask, since we're talking a lot about trust, which is something that isn't black and white, it's not like spell check. We can't just, check the dictionary a lot of the time. How do we determine who is that authority of trust and how they can be trusted?
It's excellent. It's an excellent question.
Do you mean specifically in terms of the people that you're talking to? Like, how can I trust the information that I'm getting from someone? I think a lot of it, though, despite the changes and despite how this business is transforming and evolving, there are some very fundamental things that we've always done as journalists, right? How has anyone ever trusted the source that they've cultivated? It's time, right? It takes time. And there are a variety of ways of cross-checking, and checking the details of what they're saying, checking the quality of the person. All newspapers all media outlets have their guidelines around use of anonymous sources, for example, right? So if someone's telling you something and it's a single source, how do you check what they're telling you in a way that doesn't require that source to be the definitive voice on that thing? It doesn't always happen instantly. Sometimes it can take you months, it can take you years to finally break a story that you've been working on for a really long time. I have a friend who's worked in a lot of places that aren't necessarily the easiest places to work, and one of the things that he talked about was how in a lot of countries the best stories that journalists have are the stories that they've never told because it's just been too dangerous or it's been really hard to verify. The best stories I think that journalists in this country have are the stories that they've already told because they've been able to verify them. I think that's one of the things that the technology does is it makes us impatient because we're so used to just sort of instant results in a lot of ways. You tweet something, you get a response. You post something, you get a like. But a lot of this business is just going to be that old-fashioned sitting around, cultivating, cross-checking, cross-referencing, verifying, and talking to people who've been through it. That's what I can offer.
I think there's a related question, too, which is about how readers know which information to trust when they're looking for news sources. And I think that certainly on social media and on the internet, that has been a question that tech companies have wrestled with. You go to a newsstand and sometimes the tabloid shape is going to give you a different kind of story than a broadsheet, or because of context that a story placed above the fold is going to be more important. And so there are all these cues that you used to have in a print world that don't exist online. And so I think we've all been thinking about, is there a way to have special designations for different news sources? One of the reasons I know we're also interested in digital literacy, in other words, educating, starting young and with people who are just coming online, to teach them how to read stories, is to understand what you're saying about anonymous sourcing from the other end. How do you know if a source is anonymous that it might be a trustworthy source to read because there's other cues within the story? Or is that not a good news source and you need to go find someone who's quoting someone on the record? And the same goes, we talk a lot about, could there be footnote? Early on, people didn't want to have hyperlinks in stories to click through because they didn't want to take you off wherever you were reading to somewhere else. That's now standard practice. I think if a story doesn't have links in a piece, there's something suspect, because that's what allows you to go do the provenance of that particular story. So these are cues that are, the trust cues I think are evolving, but that's something I think we think a lot about. Sorry, you wanted to jump back in.
Well, just one small thing, and I don't want to dominate the conversation, but, that idea also of, what's our obligation as journalists to help the reader trust us, right, is something I think that we also need to think through. So sometimes I'll read something and I'll say to myself, well, why should I believe this? And it could be the New York Times, but it's not evident to me why I should believe this other than the fact that it's in the New York Times. And so what are our obligations as journalists to also be more transparent about how we arrived at where we arrived at? Is that an editor's note at the bottom of the story? Is that some sort of annotated version of the story where people can click through and see comments from the reporter to say, this is how I got here? What is that? And one of the problems, though, like when you mentioned the sort of the verifying thing, the ways that we distribute our news are through private corporations like Facebook, like Twitter. So that's another problem. How much do we want private corporations to mediate what news is and what news isn't? That's another question, right? Which I haven't heard a satisfying answer to. So,
Did you want to?
Yeah, I think one last thing I want to add is that I wonder who your question is for. Because I know a lot of young people don't go to one single source. They don't say, like, this is my newspaper and I'm never reading anything again, right? A lot of the time when I see misinformation spread, it's not always coming from young people, because we can always just Google it super quickly, right? And figure things out for ourselves. I think that a big part of media literacy is people who did not necessarily grow up with the internet the way I did, maybe. So, for example, when I go on a lot of fake news sites, I see advertisements that are targeted at seniors. For example, 55 plus. Do you have cancer? Do you have liver damage? Try these medications. And I think that approach of that question of who do we trust is a very different question depending on who you ask it for or to.
Yeah, that's a great point. John?
This applies to journalism and also every organization. The most trustworthy organizations are organizations that cannot be co-opted by one power center. And in the old-fashioned model of journalism, you could get the strongman editor or publisher who would just control everything. Say, you can't write about that, you can't write about that, publish that even though it's not true. And in any organization where that takes place, whether it's Hollywood or the armed forces or government, you are going to have corruption and you're going to have a lack of accountability. The good news is that in modern media organizations, there are multiple power centers. There are multiple power centers because the balance of power between writer and editor has changed. A good story used to be what an editor said a good story was. Now, a writer has his or her own constituency, which is based on Chartbeat. I know you don't like Chartbeat, but it actually empowers writers to say, hey, you told me not to write that story about so-and-so. Hey, guess what? You want to know how many hits it has? And you want to know how many, and it actually has completely revolutionized the workplace, because it's no longer what the editors say goes. There's actually more of a back and forth based on the data. And another power center, readers through social media can push back against what they see as misinformation. It used to be 20 years ago, if you published something that was obviously untrue, you might get 17 school teachers from Victoria who would write in, you'd publish 2 of their letters, and that was it. Now, it doesn't stop there. You've got Twitter, you've got Facebook, and the drumbeat keeps going until the newspaper or whatever media organization publishes a correction. That's another power center. So, to my mind, that actually increases the level of trust because you can never have an organization that's co-opted by someone who wants to suppress a particular truth or advance a particular agenda insulated from other opinions.
That's great. Another question? Great. Back here in the back.
Hold on 1 second.
Oh, there's a microphone coming. There you go.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Therese Ebden, and I started out back in 1997. I'll take you back a little while. I was at Torstar Electronic. I was a Ryerson journalism student, and I answered an ad on the job board, and I was working for The Convergence, Canada's daily news on the web about the web. And we were in there writing stories about, could we get video streaming one day? What would the internet look like one day? And we're all mostly Ryerson journalism students at the time, and there was this office off in the corner, and that was the sales guy who just needed to get enough ad revenue so we could get paid one day. So fast forward, here we are, it's 2017. We're in the room with Facebook. I think it's great. We're having this conversation. But I wanted to ask you, because for me, I've watched all through my career in journalism and then moving on to communications, how has digital really disrupted journalism and the overall communications industry? What is the model going forward? How are we going to pay everyone to do the great things that we're talking about today? So I think that is really the elephant in the room.
Well, I have my thoughts. You want to jump in? Sure.
Well, I would say that's one reason that journalists are paying attention to the data, because subscriptions or the people that consume the news. I mean, I know the New York Times now makes more money from subscriptions than ads for the first time ever. And I think one negative thing about the digital era is that people really have come to believe that news is free, right? When I was growing up, my parents got a couple papers and they paid for cable, and I knew that was the thing they paid for, and it really has become a free idea, and I think part of it is reconvincing people to pay. But I also think that if social media platforms are going to distribute stories, then maybe finding a way to share ad revenue is another thing that needs to be discussed.
Jump in? Yeah. So I agree, and I will say the subscription model that we're starting to see, at least in the United States, which is what I'm familiar with, is really something to keep an eye on. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal all have had giant subscription leaps in recent, about the last year. Some of that, they believe, could be the Trump effect, that people have become re-engaged with the news. But some of it they believe is sustainable far beyond that, because they've precisely decided to start breaking this model. That everyone had been afraid, and certainly it was true when I was at the Washington Post, everyone was afraid to charge money for it because it was free everywhere. People are just going to go someplace else. And I think over time, with enough credibility, the thinking has changed. That if you're credible enough, if you're trustworthy enough, people will be willing to, when they hit that paywall, whether it's 5 or 10 articles in, to pony up a little bit of money. Now I think that's good for the big national institutions that have a following and get readership all over the world. I don't know what that does for local readers, and I think that's where certainly a lot of our attention at Facebook is trying to figure out, okay, yes, we could certainly, I'm not even sure it would be worth it to the New York Times or Wall Street Journal to, certainly not somewhere like the Journal that charges a high premium, to go into a deal with us as much as it is for them to charge on their own, but for the local news outlets that can't compete with the big ones, how do we help be a better partner? How do we figure out how to not just expand their reach, but expand their revenue? I will say, pre-Facebook, pre-Google, and when I was in journalism, everyone was already worried about the economics of it. That the subscriptions had started to go down for the print paper before we were digital at all. And so there have been, I think, a confluence of things that have come together at once, which is why we have to all do it, I think, together. Jane?
Yeah,
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point. And I think that we need to look at our own news habits and figure out how to monetize them. Like I was saying earlier, I'm a millennial. I jump around everywhere. You know, I will read the Washington Post and the New York Times and the New Yorker, but then I'll go to BuzzFeed and then I'll go somewhere else, then I'll go to Facebook. And we need to figure out how to monetize that, because I don't know if selling a handful of individual subscriptions is really the solution. Micropayments were a good idea, but there's a big barrier to them. So paying, for example, 15 cents for an article. So maybe the idea is to build, oh God, I can't believe I'm going to say this, a Netflix for news. I'm sorry, where you can go to every single publication that you want, and you can pay the 15 cents without having to commit to long-term, I don't know, year-long subscription, right? And then it's a headache to cancel because you have to pick up the phone, and I'm a millennial, I don't pick up the phone, you know? So I think that the key would be to look at how are people reading the news and how can we make money off of it.
I think is, you know, people who've been able to kind of take their personal, you know, their personal efforts at sleuthing and accountability and build a following, and people are willing to do. So they sort of do a couple of things, right? They might have a column somewhere, and then they also have like support through some sort of payment platform. And then they'll also have people just wanting to send them money because they like the work that they do. And so it's become, in a lot of ways, the successful writers, and you can see them if you've been following them on social media, say over the course of 5 years, you can see them go from somebody who's not very popular to someone who's extremely popular. But of course, what ends up happening is that you then have a collection of high-profile, well-branded individuals who may be doing very good work, but it may be very niche, right? And it may be very specific to the kind of thing that they're interested in. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, there is that model, Jane, that you're talking about for magazines, I think. What's that called? There's something. Yeah, where you basically can get like a bunch of different magazines from the same.
Texture, I think, is the Canadian one.
Yeah, and, you know, you pay like a flat and you can get. But the problem, of course, with journalism is what falls away, right? Like what gets left behind. And a lot of times it's the service journalism that gets left behind. It's the local news that gets left behind. It's the, you know, what happened at City Hall that gets left behind. So yeah, I don't know. You know, the question, you know, if someone can come up with a solution, they're going to be an overnight billionaire, I think. But you know, that's the thing. How do you pay for something that people feel they're entitled to for free, that costs a lot of money to produce, that has an accountability and trust issue, and that can be at times hard to discern from just crap that someone made up? So yeah, there you go. Discuss.
That's the challenge. Right over here up front, we've got somebody with a question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rhoda Taylor. I am with the Bramptonist, and we're actually exactly in that position of the local media, the local news that you're talking about right now. The shift that we have seen is, for instance, our City Hall reporter in the city of Brampton. It's with the Brampton Guardian. It's covered by Torstar. So in the last few months, Torstar now has been printing the major articles. But that's the thing. The difference between Torstar versus something else is that they have the money to back it up, as well as the readership to back it up. So I know right now, as, Nahid, sorry about that. As you mentioned, you don't really know what the answer is to support the municipals and the smallers, but is there any other way that you can think of to bring attention to the smaller media outlets, because most of us aren't getting that recognition and coverage, especially as these clicks now are going towards the main media outlets?
Any thoughts here?
I think there's a real allergy to collaboration in the media right now. We've seen large media collaborate on smaller stories, but for example, would the Globe and Mail ever publish an article from, the Bramptonian? Brampton, sorry. On their Facebook page? Maybe not really, but it could be beneficial. And I think maybe lending each other that credibility could be one of the ways that the bigger media can help out the smaller media. And in turn, if you have a scoop, you know, it works vice versa.
Great. Did you want to jump in or go for it?
So one word we haven't mentioned, I think, is charity. One of the greatest things Donald Trump did was that he convinced people that a good, responsible media is part of civil society and that it has to be sustained in the same way hospitals are sustained and libraries are sustained. And that's why you saw subscriptions surge to the New York Times and Atlantic, and you saw donations surge to Mother Jones. People forget that Mother Jones is a nonprofit entity. Commentary magazine, nonprofit entity. I just subscribed to The Masthead, which is Atlantic Magazine's new way, essentially, to get money in a quasi-charitable way, which basically says, we really want to bring you high-concept news. We can't think of a way to get it from you clicking or buying paper, so can you just kind of give us money? And it's not tax deductible for me. I'm a Canadian citizen. I don't think they operate as a charity. But I give it for the same reason that I give to my old college and I would give to a hospital. In Canada, we're behind the times there because we have the CBC. And as with many things, we say, well, we're already paying with our taxes. But I think ultimately the model is going to be in the same way NPR. I mean, one of the reasons NPR is great is because the widow of the guy who founded McDonald's gave $500 million to NPR. Where, her name was Ray Kroc, where is the equivalent Canadian who's going to give that kind of money to the Bramptonist and 1,000 other publications? But that is going to happen. People are going to have to see responsible media as something they give to in their charity, in their estate planning, in the same way they're already doing it in the United States.
Well, and of course, there's a trend to, which is not exactly charity, but a trend of very wealthy benefactors, billionaires, to buy up newspapers, the Boston Globe, and
in his new book, Franklin
Yes.
IV of the New Republic, and there's a cautionary tale there.
Of course,
Have you
yes.
read the book?
Yes.
Okay, so you know all about it.
Yes.
You should tell the audience about the book.
So the New Republic had been purchased by Chris Hughes, who was an early Facebook founder, and Frank Foer, who is the editor. The book is, I can't remember the title of it now, but it is a cautionary tale. He is skeptical that technology is our salvation. Other questions? Let's see, right here in the front. Thank you, in the blue shirt.
Hi, my name's Stavros. I have a company called Expertise Finder. My question's for Patrick. La Presse has done some very interesting things, obviously not printing the paper, essentially. And Quebec is quite an insular model, a place in the sense that they're not competing like we are here in English in North America. And Quebecers don't jump over to the French market or the French-speaking market in Europe as much. Are there any lessons here? Because I think it's quite interesting what you're trying to do there that you would maybe bring to those in the English-speaking part of the country that's, I don't know, around technology or maybe things that have failed.
We have this, it's a great device. It's called La Presse Plus, plus for, La Presse Plus. We ditched paper, dead trees, and the only day that we do have dead trees is on Saturdays, and January 1st, this will all be finished. Of course, La Presse has a deep bond with the Quebec readership, with Quebec people. It's a trusted institution. And nowadays, if you want to read La Presse, you have to read La Presse on the tablet. I mean, we do have a website, but we don't put our exclusive there. We don't put most of our columnists there, or not when, the day that they publish. I'm not saying it's the best strategy. I know that the Toronto Star did buy our platform. They chose to go another route. They published, they kept on publishing the Dead Tree edition, and they published on the Star Touch, right? I don't know if it's a good strategy. I'm not a Toronto reader. I would think that the only lesson here is to try to have a deep bond. I think that in the end, if something does save us at La Presse, whether it be on a tablet or on a on the phones or whatever, it will be because the readers have this deep bond with this newspaper. And I cannot overstate the fact that this bond is very, very, very deep. So that's my best answer, because yes, we have an insular culture. I mean, if you're in Quebec and you want to be well informed about Quebec, it's not as if you're living in Nevada, and you want to be well informed about the United States. You have a lot of outlets. You have, national newspapers and stuff. You're not going to read stuff about Quebec in Le Monde in France. You're not going to read stuff in Quebec CBC News. You are, but not as deeply ingrained. You're going to read La Presse. You're going to read Radio-Canada. You're going to read Le Journal de Montréal. That's about it. So I think that's what's going to save us in the end, is this deep bond we have. One of my fears is that, I'm not going to tell you the first names in French, but you read some. My name is Patrick. It's fairly, you can be young, you can be old, but the names of the people who write me, they're fairly old. They're fairly old. We don't have these young, first names. We do, but maybe they don't have time to write to us.
Good. Okay.
Well,
right here.
Same thing on Twitter. It's the older crowd.
Also in the front. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Marlene. I work at the CBC, and we've talked a lot tonight about the technology and the data that you can collect through that technology, how many people are reading a story and how long they stay on a story. And I'm wondering how you think we're doing in terms of analyzing that information, interpreting that information, and whether it's having an impact on what work is getting done.
That's good. Let's see who. Go for it.
Well, so I also work at the CBC. I find for me, I work at ideas, and so I find that for us, the sort of the analysis has to do more with, it's not so much about what people who are listening to the show are saying, because we sort of get good feedback from the show and the podcast downloads. But in terms of the Facebook interactions, that always seems to be, what resonates, and there's a very careful watch on how things get picked up on social media and how to replicate that. But it's a small unit, it's a small show, and it's very, I think, different than what else you hear on the radio. So maybe that's an easier conversation to have, because it does end up being very sort of intimate. What does it say for a bigger show or for a daily where I've also worked? How do we think about those sorts of things? One of the challenges I find in the CBC context is it's unclear to me, and maybe if there's somebody here who's more senior than I am, they can speak to it. What's unclear to me is, what are we trying to do with that information? I think the CBC is a bit of a different model, just because it's a public broadcaster, and so it's probably having a different conversation what the privates are having. But, if you have a mandate and you have an idea of what you need to be, can you effectively be that thing when you're comparing yourself to what the privates are doing? Perhaps there's somebody who has a better answer than I do. It's unclear to me what it is that we're aiming for, because I think the objective of the public broadcaster is something different. Maybe you have a different idea what we're trying to do, but that's kind of where I'm coming from on that question.
The quick answer is that the data on how long people stay on a page is super fascinating, and it doesn't invade people's privacy. It's strictly metadata. It's basically you're just looking at people as generic units. But I can tell you that the typical newspaper story, people look at it for about 45 seconds. And when they look at it for less, like if they look at it for 15 or 20 seconds, it's because you've ripped them off with a headline that doesn't represent the story. So, it's a good headline, and then they read it and they, oh, no, that's not the story. And then, so you can actually get feedback on how good the story is. When I was a magazine editor, The longest average retention time we had on an article was 8 minutes. And that was the cover story we did on Vancouver real estate. And that told me more about the story than the number of hits I got. And that kind of data has only been available fairly recently. Like in terms of actual page view data, that's been available for a long time. A lot of this has been facilitated by Google Analytics. Google Analytics, like you can spend a whole day looking at the data. It's crazy how much data they have. And you can tell what Canadians want to read by looking at that viewer retention data. It doesn't necessarily help you sell them stuff, but it helps you become a better journalist, because you can tell, or Denise does a podcast. I guarantee you that the company will tell her the average person listened to this for 14 minutes or 17 minutes or 20 minutes. I don't know if you look at that data, Denise, but does that interest you? Like, is that when you look at that, does it surprise you how long people are listening?
Yeah, so at the Globe, I think what's most interesting, I mean, obviously a lot of clicks is interesting, but retention is what's more important, because it shows that people actually care about a story. Sometimes I think when I see something that's only 3 minutes, if that seems disappointing, I often go back to stories. I actually just re-Googled the BuzzFeed story on Breitbart today because I knew I hadn't read it. I'd gone back a number of times today. I actually sat down and read it, so I probably got like a full 8 minutes in there. But retention is the most important, because it means that people care enough to come back and finish it. And we can also see at the Globe whether it's been on the chain to lead to a subscription, and that's always nice too. It's like, oh, I got a sub out of that one. So I think the days of bare clicks are mostly done.
I'm certain that there is a value in knowing what Canadians want to read, as John said. But I always thought there's a mystery to journalism as well. It's also a bit about giving them what they don't know that they want. But
sometimes those things do really well as well.
And just want to get to one point. A couple of years ago, I think it was 3 years ago, it must have been judging from the emails I got, one of my most read stories was a column, 3,500 words, about the Higgs boson. How do you say that? The Higgs boson. It's a very complicated thing, but there was this physicist who works at the CERN in Switzerland who participated in the discovery of this thing, and he's from Quebec. So he was in Montreal, and I interviewed him for 2 hours. Didn't understand a thing, but the little I understood, I did a column about it. It was like on the pad, on the tablet, it was a 5-part thing about 700 words each. I mean, the response was fabulous. And I'm not saying we should not try and see what Google Analytics says or whatever. It's not what I'm saying. Just saying there's a mystery to journalism that must not be killed by a statistic-driven frame of mind. If I had asked my readers next week, what do you want me to write about? They would never have said this, weird discovery that has happened underneath the mountains in Switzerland. So sometimes you do have to try and defy the expectations of statistics. That's my humble opinion.
I just wanted to add that maybe one last thing to look at when looking at statistics is finding leaks and where to plug them. So by that I mean, just because nobody read your article, it doesn't mean that people were not interested in it. It doesn't mean that people who read it didn't walk away with an impression. What it means, maybe, one of the things it could mean, among all the others that I've already said, is maybe it didn't find the right audience online yet. Maybe we need to rethink how we distribute it, who we show it to, and how we show it. I don't know if clicks necessarily does it, but look at where it's sharing online, for example, who's sharing it, and maybe even look at their Facebook posts or their tweets and to figure out why. And that data point can really be informed in how we spread the journalism, the wonderful Higgs boson thing that everybody read, or anything else, I think.
Great, one over here. Wait, there's a microphone for you. Hang on one second.
Arnold, Nomad. I was really interested in Claude's comment, and I had the privilege of seeing Remains of the Day last night again. And one of the themes that really struck me was just the development of the idea of the propensity of humanity to think superficially and be interested in gossip, all things superficial, and the aversion to deep thinking, excuse the reference, but just in the comments that some of the panel have made, and just the phrasing of the question, how much do people, or do the panel members feel that journalism is focused really on promoting and encouraging deep thinking as opposed to superficial thinking?
Who has a thought? Yeah.
I don't know if that comment is specifically about clicks or data, but to get back to the podcast, which was just one series, I found the data so encouraging because it was a podcast about race in Canada, and we just pitched it as a cold idea, and it was very much about deep thinking and an uncomfortable subject. And our goal was, I think we wanted to get 5,000 listens because one of us heard that was what a bestseller is in Canada, and we blew that number out of the water so strong from the very first minute. And so the idea that clicks are a superficial way, sure, a click is. When I worked at the Toronto Star, I remember being pulled off a story because this was the day of clickbait, and it was David Beckham has a new tattoo, and I had to go and write that story instead of whatever I was working on. But I really don't think the data works that way anymore. I really think, for myself, I have found it has really proven to me and to my editors that there is an audience for deep thinking. And I am grateful, and I am grateful for the way that it allows me to interact with the audience, honestly.
Let's take one last question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up here. Did someone, I think you had a question here in the front? Yeah, let's see if there's a microphone still.
Hi, I'm Christy, and I'm from CBC, The National. I have a question about, I guess, less about fake news in terms of what's coming from Macedonia, Hillary Clinton, pedophile ring, whatever. It's more about how do you combat the idea of people having their own truths, especially, the idea that people get their news from social media. You follow specific news outlets on Facebook. The algorithm is very tailored to you. And obviously in this room, everyone here cares about journalism or journalists themselves, but for regular people who maybe are only getting their news from Facebook, for example, or Twitter headlines, how do you go beyond that? Because sometimes truth does get lost in that sense.
Thoughts? Yeah, Patrick?
This is one of my biggest fears as a journalist. I don't know how I can compete with people who want to believe stuff. That's what I said in one of my first answers. There's a great article that was written in The Atlantic recently. It's called Fantasyland, and the guy wrote a book, and it's about how people create their own realities and how the founding of the United States is fertile ground for creating alternate realities. I have no idea. I have no idea how to convince some of my readers that, just because a woman wears a hijab, she's not a terrorist. Some people want to believe that. I do not know how to convince them otherwise. So this is, apart from the business model, this is one of the things that keeps me up at night. How do I convince people that the reality in which they have insulated themselves, where they find refuge, because maybe it's easier to explain the world when you have simple truths in an alternate reality. How do I pinch that bubble? I have no idea. Sorry, I would like to have an answer. I don't.
So this is an idea that I floated in the green room before the panel, and it was universally disliked, but I'm going to say it anyway. Oh, you like my idea?
Yeah. Semi-like.
All right. Okay. So there's a lot of buzz about my idea. which is that the war on fake news is like the war on drugs. It's driven, you're never going to win it because it's driven by demand. The demand for fake news is driven by demand, not supply. And I say this because, Christy, as you know, I wrote that book about conspiracy theories, I guess 4 or 5 years ago. And at first I thought the most interesting part of that book was going to be the conspiracy theories themselves. That's actually the least interesting part. The most interesting part is the psychological reasons why people want to believe conspiracy theories. They're very precious to them. They know there's lots of things on the internet that can debunk it. It's not like they don't know how to find Wikipedia or the New York Times or the Globe and Mail. They know exactly where that is. But for emotional reasons, they choose to believe these things, and these things become very precious to them. And they are symptoms of what's going on in the world, and lack of trust. These people need an explanation for evil in a secular world where they can't blame things on a devil. We haven't quite processed how to do that. That's something we just haven't figured out. In many cases, they have high anxiety, they've gone bankrupt, diseases, fear of death. I mean, you name it. You're not going to control those things by saying, oh, we've developed this new filter. See this little icon? That means I think those are well-intentioned, but I think it's driven by demand. And if you want to get rid of fake news, help create a world where these people don't require fake news to get them through the day, because it is like a drug. I think it's great that Facebook and Twitter are doing these things to try and lead people in the right direction. I'm a little skeptical whether it'll do anything. Facebook, we talk about religion. Facebook is like going to church because everybody in your circle of friends thinks like you do, and it's very comforting, and you say, peace be upon you, and you leave. And then you go on Twitter, and it's the Inquisition. So these are replacements for religion in a secular world. And religion by its nature and faith and tribalism are not rational. And just because you say, oh, the library's over there, go look in the dictionary, go look in the World Book, I'm dating myself, that's, those things, it doesn't help because they have an emotional need for it. That's my view.
That is that's the perfect note to end on there. We will be gathering for drinks after this. I think people may need one, it seems like. I'd like to first thank our panel. Thank you, panelists here. And then I'd like to welcome Natalie Turvey, who's the Executive Director of CJF up here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And on behalf of the CJF, I'd also like to thank our stellar panel for joining us for this lively debate and discussion about truth and technology. I had the opportunity last week to see Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, speak in California. He got a standing ovation when he walked into the room, which tells us a lot about the power of this tool. And on stage, he was asked, do you think the internet is good or bad for democracy? He said, do you have 4 hours? He also said, the short answer is that we need to make sure that it's used in a way that's constructive and promotes truth and supports democracy, with the responsibility being on both the users and the social networks to make truth more likely to propagate. I want to thank the exceptional and accomplished Anne Kornblut for being with us. She sent us just a sliver of her storied bio, and we're honored to have her here in Toronto to lead tonight's discussion. So please join me in a round of applause for our moderator and all of our speakers. And thanks to all of you for supporting CJFJ Talks and for being engaged in these issues. We have some terrific events this season. So coming up next, on November 8th, we are in the Distillery District with some new media rivals, both online and in print, taking an optimistic look at new models for journalism. On November 30th, The New Yorker's Ryan Lizza talks to Pia Chattopadhyay about Trump's relationship and escalating attack on the news media, the enemy of the American people, and that infamous explicative-laden call with the mooch, Anthony Scaramucci. On January 31st, we're joined by the man who brings us the story behind the story. CNN's Brian Stelter, host of Reliable Sources, will be here for a discussion on the state of media with Global National's Donna Friesen. And our thanks, finally, to Kevin Chan and to his team at Facebook for supporting tonight's event, and to the Facebook Journalism Project for championing an important and timely news literacy award. Our awards program opens January 2018. We encourage you to go to our website and have a look and apply. Our awards and fellowships program celebrate excellence, lifetime achievement, and provide some amazing opportunities for young journalism talent, Indigenous journalists, and journalists shedding light on women's equality issues. And now I'd like to invite you to stay with us, meet our speakers, and join us for a cocktail reception in the other room. Thanks again for being with us.